Gareth Dennis is an engineer and writer specialising in transport systems and policy. Previously a railway engineer, he lost his job after raising concerns about safety. Gareth is perhaps the most passionate railway enthusiast I know, and his enthusiasm really shines through. This interview was incredibly insightful, and I hope you enjoy it as much as I did. Transport is political. How much do you think there's a link between radical politics and good transport policy, if you think there's a link?
One of the things about politics, the way that you engage people with politics is by finding a thing that impacts on them, whether it's the bins or whether it's potholes, and engaging with that and going, well, okay, here's how I can make your life a bit easier. Bins are a really good example because they actually really materially impact on people's lives, but also things like social care massively impact on a lot of people's lives. Transport is in my view, the domain that cuts across absolutely everything, because whether you've got ability to get to work, get to leisure, get the kids left, right, and center, whatever it happens to be, getting away to somewhere else, whatever it happens to be, people arriving to your house, transport cuts through it all. Also, things like movement of goods, these the cost of our produce, the cost of our treats, whatever it happens to be, transport cuts through it all, and so it's inherently political. Also, it's a thing that it's one of the most meaningful, visible things that devolved power can deliver. So whether it's improved buses, whether it's something as substantial as a new bit of railway like Crossrail, the Elizabeth line being delivered down in London, discussions, of course, in our neck of the woods of infinitely long discussions about Leeds sort of mass transit. These are physical things that people can see that can be delivered at a devolved level, and therefore, by their very nature of being closer to people who actually have or ought to be closer to people who have an input and kind of get a benefit of it, it means you can engage people. And ultimately, that's a really powerful way to engage people, is by saying, here's a thing that will make a material difference to your life. Here's how you can have control over it, shape it, and run from there. So for me, transport, inherently political, but also critically inherently like a localizable issue as well.
And do you worry then that you got figures, particularly on the right, who say, well, train drivers are earning so much money, and they're trying to create a division within the working class between train drivers and nurses, for example? They love using nurses rather than saying the rail operators or the CEOs. So I understand, like, there is because when I think of the political ideology that underpins rail, I mean, I'm sorry, I'm going to go into a bit of ideology here. I do think there is like a fundamental ideology of politics within rail and how people navigate it. So whether it's using train drivers as a political point for their own kind of politics, whether it's the rejection of public rail entirely, and it's all about individualism with cars, for example. I mean, I know that's sort of a tangent there, and multiple points I've made, but
no, it's not a tangent at all. It's critical. So I love the fact that the right uses train drivers as look at those guys earning so much, because you can then respond saying, yeah, they are strongly unionized, extremely skilled. That's what happens if you have a strong union and you have and the union supports and actually nurses, teachers, whoever it is, who are also, by the way, quite well unionized and do benefit from that. It's like a gold standard. They can strive to have that. All of us as workers can almost use train drivers as like a gold standard of what you can achieve if you have a strong union who is powerful and who knows how to apply the thumb screws in a way that gets the right thing for their workers. So it's in a way, it's a really, I'm always glad when the right use that example, and I even refer to it in the book. I'll plug that later. I even refer to the book, the fact that your train drivers are constantly used as this example, and it's brilliant because you can then hold them up and say, well, actually, they are succeeding. They're benefiting from a really strong kind of labor organization. So yeah, it's good in a way that they use the example, but it is frustrating that can be used as a wedge, and in a way, the frustration of that wedge being used. You talk about individualization and the ideology associated with railways. Railways cut through all of this in a variety of ways, both within the rail industry, in that you've very much got in groups and out groups within the industry, depending on what mood government is in. So you have the kind of the chief executive class, the kind of the C-suite class, particularly with the industry being so fragmented. You've got those who benefit materially from personally and sort of from private capital within the rail industry. Worth saying, not necessarily from the train operations; those aren't hugely beneficial beneficial to people. Also worth saying, it's not that we get rid of the management class within the rail industry. Actually, as with any sector, NHS, whatever it is, actually having a good management class of skilled people, skilled managers, is critical to make sure that those who are doing stuff at the front line aren't also having to be their own managers. Being a good manager is a skill in and of itself. And in fact, one of the major problems in our industry, the rail industry, as much as in health as in other sectors, is expecting the doers to also be their managers, because they end up delivering a lot less and not being great managers in the process. So having a really good, well-skilled management class is really important. What's quite interesting, this is an aside, but we can maybe pick up on it later. One of the things that British Rail did when it was when the railways were a single state-owned organisation. Critically, actually, single is almost a more important word there than state-owned. A single organisation was that we spent a lot of time training good managers, and those managers were trained across domains. They spent time at the front line, they spent time as drivers, they were in design offices, they were in signal boxes, the whole works, to understand the systemic nature of the railways. And that, two things. Firstly, gave them an excellent understanding of railways, but secondly, gave them that kind of class understanding. It gave them a solidarity and a respect for those who are at the front line. And that's something that we have lost as our industry was fragmented. The management class have split away and almost they've got distance. So both from a management understanding the front line, from a technical and a systems optimizing the railway perspective, but also from a class consciousness perspective, that distance has not been good. And so there are major benefits to pulling the management class back towards workers in the sense of reunifying a railway, and the ideology associated with keeping the industry fragmented absolutely plays into that.
So you talked about a single organization, right? And I get, like, there's so many threads in there I find so interesting. I really want to dive in. But the single organization thing, that kind of tells me that simply just renationalizing railways, whilst better than the privatized system, isn't enough. I mean, we know we're going through this at the moment. The Labour Party are looking at they will be renationalizing railways. But it's not a fix-all, as I think you're kind of trying to say there. Of course, fragmentation is a byproduct of privatization, which we are going to get into in a bit.
Absolutely critical. Like, okay, the renationalisation, in fact, on the day we're recording this, we just had the announcements about South West Rail being nationalised, but actually a lot of fanfare. This will be the first. It isn't the first, because LNER, Northern, TransPennine, and Southeastern are all under what's called Directly Operated Holding Limited, which is the DfT's arm's length company. They are all nationalised as it speaks. The trouble is that they are all still bits.
Yeah.
So if we see a situation, I almost don't like using the word nationalisation, because the infrastructure has been nationalised for a decade. We've got bits have already been. So let's say it's all very well bringing these elements under state control, but if they remain fragmented, if they remain kind of spurred off as their own bits, we're not going to solve these bigger problems about getting a railway system that acts as and behaves as a system and can be managed as a system. So first step, it is a good first step that we are sort of starting to essentially get rid of the extra extraneous waste of having all the lawyers and contract managers to kind of run that interface. Because these train operators have basically been under state control for a very long time, but whilst kind of drip feeding some of their stuff.
They almost
but inherently,
so, wouldn't they?
The railways are a system, and when government is controlling the levers of the infrastructure or what the timetable is supposed to be, then there's very little room for a private operator to kind of shift around anyway. So it's kind of pointless. Like the only reason that privatization really was, firstly, it was as a tool to smash unions harder, because BR, by the way, had squeezed all the fat. British Rail had squeezed all the fat out of our industry already. So there was only one lever left to really squeeze, and that was working conditions and pay for frontline staff. And well, as soon as any of that had been done by the train operators, or rather they realized there wasn't much they could do on that front, well, they only really became a shield for government to pretend it wasn't their problem, that there were challenges on the railway. And then we saw that completely disintegrate back in May 2018, which was when lots of people watching this might remember there was a big timetable collapse. So we had a change in timetable, but we didn't have we didn't have the right tracks in place. In the case of us in the north, there was a lot of electrification and missing, and there were tracks, particularly around Manchester, that just hadn't been built that were necessary to deliver that timetable. Loads of trains hadn't been delivered because, again, there was a lack of electrification, so that would naturally have cascaded diesel trains and so on and so on. So we didn't have the tracks, we didn't have the trains, and of course with those, we didn't have the ability to train the right drivers to then run the service. So in May 2018, for us up in the north particularly, the timetable just collapsed. And I'm sure people have those scenes in Manchester and Leeds of people just stood with a third of trains being cancelled, just basically like not being able to go to work for weeks. An absolute calamity. And we've not changed anything since then. Like, there's been lots of talk. We've started to see these kind of discussions of legislative changes from government, but we're still in a place where, what is that, 6 years on from that collapse, on its way to more than that, 7 years, and we've not actually seen any material changes. So yeah, those changes are critical, but the idea that just bringing the elements as they are under state control fixes everything, it doesn't. It's a very small first step. Tiptoes, right direction, but tiptoes.
We're going to talk about the Labour Party in a second, because I think this ties into it. But you mentioned skills shortages, which we had that conversation when it comes to the NHS, but not with rail. So it's very interesting. And specifically with one worker, that's yourself. You're working as a rail engineer at Sistra, one of the companies that was awarded a contract by Network Rail for voicing safety concerns. What's even more astonishing about this is that the rail minister at the time, Peter Hendy, specifically got involved to have you removed, going as far as to threaten future contracts with Sistra. Tell me more about this story.
Yeah, so this all kicked off at the start of this year. So kind of April, I gave a fairly soft interview to The Independent talking about Euston Station. Actually, it's quite an interesting piece because it's talking about the passenger experience. And I think far too often in the railways, we get obsessed with the operational or the engineering and stuff like that and forget about the front and centre. We think about passenger experience, particularly for disabled people, something I'm really passionate about. And Euston is the word that constantly comes up from the various WhatsApp groups that I'm in from disabled people in the campaigning I do is unsafe. And so I used that word unsafe in the interview. At the time, Hendy was the chair of Network Rail, so the nationalised infrastructure operator, so very much a public body. He was the chair of Network Rail, so kind of one of the two kind of very senior positions, the other being the chief exec. And as chair of Network Rail, he saw this interview that I'd done in April, and by May, so a month later, a letter was sent to my employer, Sistra, one of the design consultancies, one of many design consultancies, but Network Rail being their main sort of source of projects, and threatened, essentially, not essentially, he did threaten them. He threatened them to withhold contracts if they didn't deal with me. And he then chased that with a further email, further threatening. So there's the letter that went out that was public, but also a follow-up email a few days later saying, I will go to your shareholders and headquarters if you don't deal with him. So a very clear get rid of him type. There is no, for a private organization like a company like Sistra, what other action is to be pressed like that again and again? It's quite clear that the intent from
we absolutely knew
him.
what the end result was going to be of that.
Yeah, exactly. There's no other conclusion you could make from that. And so the result from that was after a completely sham investigation by Sistra, who are not blameless in this, by the way. Sistra, who could have just said that, should have stood up against Hendy and gone, here's our code of conduct, here's the law, you're breaking this, and also go and speak to the chief executive. They didn't do that. In fact, the chief executive of Network Rail, who I had spoken to separately, I said, look, Andrew Haynes, this is going to happen and it's going to be bloody messy. Can you step in and try and stop this from happening? He tried to. Sistra decided they were just done with this. They were going to get rid of me anyway. So kind of ship had sailed at that point. And so they got rid of me. So August, I was out of a job. I have a 1-year-old child, I have a mortgage, I have so and so on. So I was kicked out for having spoken. It's worth saying I wasn't a whistleblower. This is a pretty broad discussion about safety at Euston Station. There wasn't anything, there's no pertinent secret information. It was
a public, the unsafe word that you used, that was public. You kind of almost just reiterated something that we all kind of knew, but it was because, I guess, you said it as a worker in the media. It felt like almost like kind of a revenge thing. I know it's a bit more than that, but
yeah, there was. So with it, before he even sent the letter, you can see that Hendy is going, do we employ him? We should stop. And who's this guy anyway? And this clearly, frankly, it's a situation where it's a bit of a class thing. I'm a nobody. I've come from nothing. I'm just some little guy. How is I have a right to say things that Hendy at the time didn't clearly felt uppity that I was saying this and I was kind of rising above my station to kind of say these things publicly. And you can see in his kind of fairly weak responses since then, his kind of faux apologies he's given, where he sort of said, it's right that anyone can report safety through the proper channels. Now, I want to be clear, it doesn't mean that the proper channels are completely broken and corrupt. That isn't the case, but they are for a specific purpose, usually quite specific things like, I spotted this specific unsafe condition on a work site. Absolutely right that we have safe reporting processes for things like that. But for big systemic things, kind of like broad issues about overall accessibility at a station that are a result of government policy, a result of decades of different decision-making, that there is no process, there is no formal process to deliver that sort of state, to deliver those sorts of things. That's a thing that you, as experts, talk about broadly and hope that there is a response. It just happens to be that I used that word unsafe, which extremely upset Lord Hendy.
This speaks to the point, perfectly speaks to the point you're making earlier about it's not just about nationalisation, there's issue with fragmentation, because what we have here is National Rail, which is a public body, and the chair is acting like it's a private body, because He's making a decision based not on safety, but because he thinks this will undermine business. I mean, this is exactly the issue of privatization, how it undermines public safety. Because in one of the emails sent by Hendy, he said, and I quote, by the way, finding a potential supplier criticizing a possible client reflects adversely on your likelihood of doing business with us or our supply chain. This surely wouldn't have happened if not only was our railway completely publicly funded, but also was efficient and wasn't fragmented, which, by the way, is really surprising because Keir Starmer appointed him as Minister for Rail, despite the fact that Labour are currently undergoing rail nationalisation.
Yeah, it's a very strange thing. So Hendy's been appointed because he was the Transport Commissioner at TfL, in London under both Boris Johnson and Ken Livingstone. He is seen as a bit of a unifier in the House of Lords to get this legislation through. That's essentially the reason why he's seen as a good idea to appoint him. But frankly, he's a bit of the old guard, and the fact that he wrote that letter, he could have phoned. None of this would have happened. I would have had no evidence. He could have used the phone and threatened that way. He used a letter and a follow-up email that I then was instantly able to access through FOI and SAR. He's clearly done this before. So this is the way he operates. And I frankly don't want a railway that runs that way. I don't want it to be a wink, wink, nudge, nudge bullying type arrangement. And actually, it goes beyond even public versus private. As we've seen with the Grenfell report, as we've seen, public bodies, completely public bodies, departments can do this as well. It doesn't even need the business. If you've got the people who have this attitude at the head, that is reputation first. NHS, perfect example, where we've seen this in fact, seen legislation about whistleblowing coming out recently to kind of push against NHS being, protective over anything bad being said and actually being much more open and transparent. That culture of openness and transparency, that it needs the state to be involved and it needs the right incentives, but it also needs more than that. It needs the right cultures and the right people and that's critical because we could have a fully state-owned railway that could do the same, that could be doing exactly the same thing, pressuring
what could
workers and hiding
alleviate that
workers.
or change that? Is it more democratic accountability, you think, or what could counter culture?
One of the factors, I think, is having the right incentives about what our railways are for. I think that actually understanding that it's not about marginal small gains and actually moving away. We've always had this attitude of the railways as a business. I think that's a toxic view of the way to actually think about what the railways are. The railways are a service. I think wherever you've gone, the NHS is a business. It's resulted in the wrong incentives, the wrong outputs, the wrong cultures. I think moving to a situation where we go, what are the right incentives to the railway? By the way, I think it's mode share is the right incentive. When I say that, I mean what percentage of people and things are moving either by air, by road, or by rail. So saying we want this percentage of modal share on railways and we want it to be this much bigger by this date gives you everything else, because then you need the railway to be efficient in order to maximize the throughput with the limited resources we have. We could have a blank check tomorrow and the number of skilled people, number of people like me, as we talk about skilled workers, you could, the number of drivers, the number of staff, backroom staff, signallers, those people are still the pool we have. They don't suddenly multiply. It's not like neoliberal economists want. They don't appear out of thin air. So you could have a blank check tomorrow and still not deliver much more on the railway. So having that managed capacity, that incentive, it creates the right incentives from a doing the thing, but also allows you to create the right incentives from a culture perspective. Because rather than being all about business and that side of it, it becomes more about, right, how do we make that railway better for everyone? And broadly, how do we maximize the appeal of the railways to get everyone on board? And that's a slightly different way of thinking, in some cases a very different way of thinking to the way we've had, the way we've been pushing the industry. Even in the later days of BR, it was being pushed towards a think about it as a business sort of thing. So this isn't,
I guess that sort of culture predated neoliberalism. It had to come from somewhere, didn't it? And the first thing to do was to change the culture, change the way people think about public service or society, to then enact these policies. I guess it did, privatization didn't happen in a vacuum.
No, exactly. And it was a slow motion. The major part of it happened in the mid-90s, but actually bits of it had been peeling off, and the attitudes, sectorization as it happened in the 1980s had lots of benefits in the way that the railways were operated, unifying into city as a kind of a single brand and things like that made some sense. But at the same time, you saw some of these attitudes of the city starting to permeate across. So, from 79 onwards, that was a change across Britain, actually, and it permeated into the railways. And in some cases, there were elements of that that were quite useful. So again, it's not, I want to put ideology to one side. There are elements that you can pull from that's useful, but getting the incentives right allows you to go, that is a useful way to think about things, but that isn't. And understanding what the right attitudes and cultures are can be driven by the right incentives. And that comes from government. It comes from government, but it also comes from setting up the right structure. And the fragmentation is one problem. The level of autonomy from central government is also key, because if the DfT are doing the day-to-day running of the railways, even if the whole thing is completely state-owned and fully integrated, it won't work properly. There needs to be a sufficient level of autonomy and separation and long-term strategic thinking that's well outside of electoral cycles, and that requires a bit of distance. It requires a British Rail type organisation. It can't be, well, the railways are run by the Department for Transport. It can't be that. That won't work.
It's very true what you're saying, though, because if we would apply that logic, well, yeah, the emotional logic to the NHS, we do think about it in a different way. How many cancer patients are being seen to? That's the same logic we should apply to railways. Now, let's sort of pivot to Labour a little bit. The first part to be brought back in-house is Southern Western Railway in May. That's now the new plan, because the old plan was a little bit different. It was initially Greater Anglia or West Midlands Railway to be brought back in public ownership in February, and that was with Louise Hay as Transport Secretary, and she wanted to exercise a break clause. Of course, she resigned due to, let's be honest, a factional move by Morgan McSweeney. And I guess, we're all wondering what she did, what policy that pushed her to essentially get Morgan McSweeney to push her out. Could have it been this?
It's really difficult, because this feels trivial, because although the break clause and going earlier would have made some sense, particularly for Cross Country and Avanti, actually, as two extremely poorly performing long distance operators, it still feels like not enough to justify the push.
Exactly
whether it's a combination of that and
when I was reading the article,
and the DP World stuff, so the stuff about P&O ferries, a little bit like she was already in their bad books at that point, and at the time of her, I'm sure you've gone through that. In fact, I know you've gone through that story before, but in terms of that story, piled on top of then something else, whether it was actually that she was pushing for an earlier break with Cross Country, but even that doesn't feel off. Was it maybe that she was pushing for some of the back end reforms relating to, on the day that she was sacked, she had just launched, or the evening that she was sacked, she had just launched what was, it was I was hoping that it would be the actual strategy, but it was the puff piece that's saying there will be a strategy in a year, but it was talking about a broad integrated transport strategy, which was lots of good words. And I would have hoped following something a bit more strategic and meaningful a year later, talking about moving away from business case development to justify strategic investment and towards a vision-led, here's what we want our transport system to look like, led process for determining where to make major investments in public transport, and also devolution. So is it maybe the devolution of powers that there is clearly I don't think I'm finding it difficult to see exactly what it is. For a little while, I thought maybe it was an expansion of Heathrow, but Louise Hay had spoken about being in favour of airport expansion, although only in the context of London City and Stansted, not necessarily in terms of massive civil engineering and building extra runways for Heathrow. So it's difficult to tell. There are clearly a lot of policies in transport that are frankly backwards. Airport expansion is absolutely one of them, but also maybe there were discussions about things like the rolling stock operating companies, which the train landlords, if you like. So something that doesn't get talked about much of the rail industry is the fact that the main sap of money out of the industry is not actually the train operators. One of the reasons why the whole franchising system collapsed is because there's not much money to be made in that anymore. The two sort of sources, the two ways that money is really pulled out of the industry, one is the open access operators. So they are they don't sit within a franchise. They kind of get given some space on the railway to run their own. So Lumo is an example of a first group running their own service, and it's actually extremely lucrative and a massive pain in the ass to run the timetable on the East Coast Main Line. So that's the open access operators, but more money, far more money, comes from the rolling stock operating companies. These are the organizations that, for basically nothing, sound familiar to anyone related to Royal Mail? For basically nothing, got hold of a huge public asset that had been scrimped and saved for preceding decades, and then proceeded to literally rent it back to the rail industry at exorbitant costs, which, by the way, killed off our train manufacturing industry, because there was no incentive to buy new trains if you had this whole stock and you could just lease them out. Why would you buy new trains? That's expensive. So, 5 to 10 years of no new train orders killed our train manufacturing industry almost stone dead, almost, but not quite. And then also the amount of money that leaves the industry every year, bearing in mind we get about 10 billion quid of public subsidy into the rail industry, between 500 million and 1 billion pounds go to the rolling stock operating companies in dividends and profits alone. So it fluctuates, it varies, but at its worst during the pandemic, or just after the pandemic, 1 in 10 pounds that the government gave to the rail industry went off to Panama or to other low tax or no tax sort of havens where these three major rolling stock operating companies, the train landlords, are based. It's very difficult to exactly see where their money goes because obviously the money gets squirreled away abroad and very difficult to pick through. The Panama Papers actually helped us to dig through some of that. The RMT did some fantastic work. My union did some fantastic work actually picking out some of that data and understanding the money that was going out. But every year it is hundreds of millions of pounds goes to these train landlords. And tackling those is a major part of dealing with and fixing our rail industry. And Labour have no plans. In fact, they've explicitly said they intend to leave them as they are.
Well, I was just going to ask you that question because if we go back to Louis Hay, and I'll come back to this point as well, because it's really important. I like the term train landlords. It's very easy to digest. But yeah, I was when I was reading this piece about breaking the clause, bringing rail into public ownership before the contracts end. It didn't seem like a big enough issue. There were some businesses that kicked up a fuss. Maybe it was an amalgamation of things. But I was going to ask you, was Louise Hay potentially looking at this, which would be a big deal, which they probably wouldn't, because I don't think Labour would touch this. And obviously that then brings me to my question, were Labour going to touch it? And it seems like they weren't.
So, yeah, exactly. So I don't think Louise Hay was necessarily certainly outwardly that interested in the rolling stock operating companies, partly because it would cost money. Where the thing about the way they're doing the shift at the moment is that it doesn't cost them any money at all. The contracts end and then it comes in, which is which is kind of like, I'm kind of like, okay, fine, whatever, it's a bodge.
Yeah.
But spoiler alert, if you're not spending any money, the chances are it's not making much difference to people. And frankly, if you just let them become state-owned and don't really change anything, then it's not going to make any difference to fares. It's not going to make any difference to the day-to-day experience of passengers traveling. Because ultimately, the things like how well the system is run is by the same people in those organizations.
Precisely.
The same challenges. The challenges we have on our rail network is that we have a shortage of trains, but more critically, chronic lack of infrastructure investment, both regionally in terms of in our cities, but also kind of obviously nationally with things like HS2. So those are the main problems, and those cost billions of pounds. And then it would cost about 10 to 15 billion pounds to buy back all the trains that we've, basically essentially invested in, but just through these massive organizations, these rolling stock operating companies that then lease them back to us at enormous costs. So, for example, the express trains that run up and down the East Coast Main Line and towards Bristol, so the Azumas and the Class 800s for the real nerds out there. I know there's a few of you in the audience. So the people who know the Class 800s, those are part of what was called the In-City Express program, the most expensive trains per coach, like one of the most expensive train procurement exercises in the world, just extremely expensive, extremely poor value for money. Private Eye picked it up for decades and decades, so pointing out how much of a mess this procurement process was for trains that have ended up not being hugely fantastic. The costs of this are huge, and we could have just, and the leasing arrangement was enormous, when we could have just bought the trains ourselves. You just go, rather than having an intermediary body that you say, I'm going to give you loads of money, can you buy the trains, please? You just go, train manufacturer, can you build me some trains, please? Kind of like we used to do. You don't need the middleman. I know Britain's obsessed with creating the middleman. It comes back to fragmentation. I know I'm flying ADHD. I'm flying around all over the place, but we'll come back to this point. But I want to talk very briefly to say on fragmentation. This is an echo. The reason the railways are interesting is because they reflect a lot of the broader economy. One of the things that is seen as how we make our economy work by people who are idiots, neolibs, liberals even, is that you create as many pieces as possible, and it's the interfaces between those pieces that is where you extract economic value. So by having dozens and dozens of outsourced elements rather than just delivering everything in one organization, and these don't have to be public-private, by the way. Our construction industry, which makes sense to be by and large a private industry, is fragmented into many, many small pieces. You've got the big contractor, but they bring their staff in from zero-hour contracts, outsourcing organizations. They hire all their equipment. They, X, Y, Z. So these big contractors in Europe, generally, they just have everything, and they have their own staff, they have their own equipment. Whereas here in the UK, we have, thousands of SMEs, dozens of kind of mid-tier, and that costs extra money. But it's seen economically as a good thing by Treasury and by kind of economic people, Adam Smith Institute, etc., because you've created all those interfaces, and therefore you can create value because there's people. It's a bit like that scene in Fifth Element where the stuff gets smashed on the ground and all the little robots come out and tidy it up. That's sort of seen as our economy. Whereas actually the trouble with that as being our way of delivering an economy is that it doesn't work. It's hugely inefficient. So when it comes to actually delivering a service, NHS, railways, or building a thing, high speed 2, that way of having an economy is incapable of delivering those services or those physical things because it's so inefficient. It's hugely lumbering. And it's one of the reasons our productivity in this country is so low, is that we have fragmented everything to that way beyond even, even places like the US haven't got some of the levels of fragmentation we do. It's bizarre. So the rail industry is interesting in a way because it's a little microcosm of that, and we can see how it doesn't work for the railways, and we can extrapolate that to the wider economy, which is an interesting thing to do.
HS2. Now I was
Yeah.
I was going to ask you about, why is this such a quagmire? Why it's such a bloated project? But you've kind of answered it, which is, once again, it comes down to fragmentation, and has been pretty much fully. Well, it has been abandoned, and Labour aren't going to fully deliver on it. I mean, I was going to then say, why can't we build infrastructure in this country? I guess maybe you can give me a slightly different answer to before, because we can really dive into this, because something our country doesn't like to do is build good quality infrastructure. You look at places like China, they will do it, and we don't do it. It's very frustrating.
Yeah, it's extremely frustrating, and you don't even have to look that far afield. Look to Paris and the amount of metro infrastructure that's being built in Paris. This is a story that we often get accused of being. People sometimes occasionally get accused. We don't have to be, because we're both Northerners. London-centric stories. People talk about Elizabeth Line, Crossrail. London is suffering the same problem, actually. London, as a massive city, should be seeing much more investment in its transport. It's a very constrained city, because actually it should have been having, you look to Paris, another mega city, and they're constantly building expansions to their metro lines to deal with the kind of, and, Hidalgo, the mayor, she's been pushing for reducing, anyway, she has a vision, and they're delivering infrastructure to deliver that vision. The problem we have in the UK is we don't have that vision. So the answer to all of these questions that you're asking about is the lack of vision. HS2 failed because it didn't fit into a broader vision. So the public didn't understand what its purpose was, and it became very, Treasury deliberately kept it that way so that they could have an off-ramp to cancel it whenever they fancied, which is extremely frustrating. I've talked a bit about fragmentation as to being why we can't deliver infrastructure in this country, but with HS2 in particular, there are a few things at play, and this also deals with costs as well as the reasons for not being able to deliver it. One of the problems we have is that our infrastructure across the country has had so many decades of nothing being done, really. Lots and lots of very, frankly, effective and efficient tweaking of the existing network. So we have an incredibly well-used and frankly very modern kind of existing network, but there is only so much you can squeeze out of those two strips of steel, right? There are only so many trains, particularly where you have a mixed traffic railway. So because of the lack of urban investment and the lack of any kind of long distance investment, we're at the point where we need new high-speed lines to be built, and HS2 was kind of the first major step in that, and it's a disaster that it's not being progressed. The trouble is, because our country cannot create a vision for what we want the future to look like. Politicians either do not want to, they don't have the imagination, or they refuse to, or they're told not to by Treasury. It means that rather than going, well, we have the broad picture of what our high-speed network will look like in 2050, let's deliver bits of it, small chunks that we know that we'll need that bit, we'll need that bit. The Euston Station will be its own project. The bits around Manchester will be their own project. XYZ. No, instead we had HS2, and everything got chucked into that one enormous mega project. And of course it was going to be a failure because it's such a huge, complicated mess. One of the reasons, that's why the headline budget was so high, because it was delivering everything. Nowhere in the world delivers high-speed rail projects nowhere outside the Anglosphere delivers high-speed rail projects like that. In California, high-speed rail is making the same mistakes. In Germany, France, Spain, the high-speed rail bit would just be the bit going from just outside one city to just outside another city. So essentially the cheapest section. And then all the expensive bits, like the approaches into the cities, the new city centre stations, would be their own self-contained projects, because it would be part of a patchwork. It'd be a jigsaw puzzle of which you'd be delivering individual elements. The lack of long-term vision means that we could not do that in the UK. So we have one huge big pot that was called HS2. And of course it looks ungainly because there's so many moving parts within a massive mega project like that it's very difficult. Even if the UK wasn't a shambles organisationally anyway, it'd be very difficult to deliver a project of that magnitude. And it's just not the right way to deliver it. It doesn't make any sense. And it also makes it easy to cancel the whole thing. Whereas if it was split into lots and lots of bits and pieces that you could manage individually, for example, the bit north of Manchester connecting what would have been HS2 back onto the West Coast Main Line that was often called the Goulburn link. That's a thing that should be delivered as a self-contained project.
You said
things like that.
You said two things in there which people might have just missed, because you also said it very recently, which is that HS2 being unpopular was a political calculation, a political calculation by design. You did kind of mention it twice. I mean, it's a bold claim. I mean, your logic behind it makes sense. Is it still not a leap to come to that conclusion?
Maybe it is elite, but I stand by it because I think, frankly, Treasury will always want a way. The machination. It's funny. People gaslight us, all of us, by going, well, the reason HS2 was cancelled was because of costs, which is absolute rubbish. I'm so sorry, but did everyone miss the part where Rishi Sunak announced he was cancelling it in the Conservative Party conference without any parliamentary oversight, without any reviews with anyone in Parliament? It was done on a whim as part of off the back of extremely poor polling and a by-election loss.
Well, I guess people
did
then
everyone miss
criticise.
that?
I suppose people criticise and saying, "Well, you spent all this money, now you're just going to cancel it." But again, that's obviously the media saying that. It's not quite a good analysis, but
infrastructure costs money, you know. That's just a reality, and it's like, I would love for us to be in a situation where we can deliver these things more cost effectively, but we aren't, and we're never going to do that if we keep going, well, we can't deliver infrastructure until it's cheaper to deliver it. Yeah, but you can't make it cheaper to deliver infrastructure until you are delivering it. Why not commit to doing the work? And if we commit to doing the work, it will get cheaper. The advantage of having that long-term vision is that you can, rather than having projects are a rubbish way to deliver infrastructure. It's far better to have like lots of nice, rather than having it big discretized lumps, you deliver programs of work, of very similar work, so that you have teams of skilled people who have job security, who can build their skills, who can grow, shrink, just adapt to the right shape to deliver that work over a long period of time. And therefore, you deliver it more and more efficiently as you do more of that work. Accessibility upgrades, electrification, perfect example. You know, building new trains. These are things that should not happen as single lumps. They should be happening as, right, this is what the map needs to look like of our electrified railway. Let's crack on and start with some of the hard bits. Let's start somewhere else with some of the easy bits. Let's have several teams progressing, but as part of a whole to deliver this work. And the same for high-speed rail. Rather than it being one big bang that's difficult to manage, we should be delivering, it should be in kind of all these lots of little lumps. And if we did that, it would be able to be delivered. Treasury will never, ever accept that without major strategic change, without major structural change, because a long-term vision, as they see it, is a commitment to spending a lot of money, which they do not want to do.
I mean, that's the problem with kind of successive governments of the last 40 years. Long-term commitments seem to be no-go. And when you think short-term, it ends up costing more because you're forgetting about the returns you get. I can feel like, I mean, you could correct me if I'm wrong, but I feel like some of the things you're saying kind of sounds like the contrarian view in the Green Party when they're anti-HS2, because they say it's a big bloated project. We need to focus more on localized rail.
Yeah,
I don't think, by the way, I'm not suggesting for one moment you're anti-HS2, but are you giving credence to that sort of argument? Or
no? So I'm very strongly not. It's interesting. Of course, Greens have recently changed their position on HS2.
Yeah.
I'm pleased to have been pretty instrumental in changing their position on HS2, much to the consternation of some of the certain parts of the party. But I'm sorry, their position was extremely untenable. They were basically saying, we want high-speed trains, but we don't want any high-speed track, which obviously is that's currently what's happening at Euston Station. We've seen how that works. You can't get on a train in a puddle. Anyway, no. So the argument about the Greens were making, and certain people make, is kind of well, why are we spending on this vanity high-speed project? We should be spending on local projects and investing in the existing railway. Well, the whole point is that HS2 is an investment in the existing railway, because it's the local services that suffer by having those long-distance services that push through and force them out of the way. Because if you've got local trains that stop at lots of stations, but then you've got a 125-mile-an-hour train behind it, that requires a huge gap in the timetable, so it doesn't catch the local train up, which means you can't have many local trains.
I mean, the position makes no sense, essentially, because it's not an either or, is it?
So what I'm saying is, this is not me saying that you shouldn't have local projects. Of course you do, but you know, the example of like, oh yeah, we should be reopening this local railway. It's like, that's fine, but when that local railway meets the main line, there's nowhere for the local trains to go. So unless you intend like there to be a bus exchanged into a field, then you need more capacity in the existing railway network. So even if you want to reopen lots of, I hate the phrase reopening. We should be reopening no new railways. We should be reopening no railways. We should be building new railways that may happen to use former routes of old railway lines. It's a much better way to think of it. But if we do want to build lots of new local railway lines, then we need more capacity in the existing network as well. Again, that's what HS2 delivers us. So the Greens argument was always came from a deep misunderstanding of what HS2 was, and they've now changed that position. They've listened. They've had a really good, well-informed debate, and have moved position on that. And I'm very proud to be a member of the Green Party as a result of it's basically they've changed their position. I was like, right, sign me up.
Yeah, I am very, very happy that they have changed their position.
Yeah, and it means that it gives them it allows them to actually talk about transport, because previously their position was completely illogical. It was like, yes, we want more railways, but we don't want to deliver the thing that will actually allow us to have more railways. So they moved away from that. It doesn't mean that we shouldn't be thinking locally, but in a way, the think local, deliver global, or sort of that phrase, the Greens, which I've absolutely garbled there. But that thinking locally and globally, the matching the two is what high speed rail gives us by allowing us to actually get rid of those long distance services and think about local services more clearly. That's slightly different from what I'm saying about delivering high-speed rail in kind of more localized chunks. That's more about kind of a project management kind of discussion, really, about how you deliver this stuff. But it allows you to, rather than say HS2 is delivered and it's one massive line across the map, you go, well, you deliver the bit from Manchester to Crewe. You deliver the bit from Crewe to Birmingham. You deliver this bit. You deliver the bit from Birmingham to Bristol, and it allows you to start thinking a bit more. You get to break this big rail network into smaller chunks and deliver them in a more straightforward way.
Yeah. So if Labour kind of turned around and said, we're not going to finish the complete HS2, we're just going to build this section. That doesn't close the bigger project off, then, does it? You can say, all right, let's focus on this section, and then maybe another government after will say, let's extend it. It's not the worst thing in the world.
It's not the
hear
worst
Labour
thing in the
say
world,
that.
no, except that, given we were delivering it, by not delivering it, we're now delaying it by another decade, and we don't have our carbon budget. We just don't have that time. So much as delivering the big project was imperfect, and frankly, it was more expensive as a result, I'd rather we spend 100 billion on the whole thing than, frankly, because delivering it in smaller bits in 10 years is not going to be cheaper, by the way. We're not saving a penny, because we're going to have to build all of what HS2 had. We're going to have to build eventually anyway. By us now cancelling it, it's going to cost us more, no matter however you square that circle, it's now costing us more. The cheapest way to build HS2 is by building HS2 as we've spent 10 years, 15 years now developing it and planning it. There is no way to be cheaper. You couldn't build a single track railway with one of those push cart things cheaper than actually building HS2 now, because ultimately it's all that development, all the consultation. It costs, for any project, you should be spending about 20% on development and design. So for £100 billion project, you are spending 20 billion of those pounds on design. Right, on designing, on people in an office actually putting all the jigsaw pieces together to develop a very complicated thing like a railway, particularly places like stations that are immensely complicated. Every time you change your mind, Euston, perfect example of this, every time government changed its mind on what Euston Station was going to look like, that was hundreds of millions of pounds being torn up and then having to be respent on developing new designs. And if you're rushing those designers, of course, then it's going to be more expensive because they're kind of being more conservative in their estimates because they've got less time to actually work out the specific details. So, we should have stuck to our guns and delivered this thing. There's no way of doing it any cheaper than actually cracking on. So even though it's imperfect, we cannot let the perfect be the enemy good. So Labour, it's political. Them not saying, no, we're just going to crack on as the previous plans were. It's very easy for them, and it satisfies Treasury to then, and Rachel Reeves and her kind of slightly
very
soft,
political, very much in line with
absolutely,
the
it satisfies all that
spending of the Labour Party. Cars. Why are we, a nation, obsessed with cars? I mean, so many European nations take public transport far more seriously. It's more ingrained in their culture. But here, public transport is often looked down upon. I mean, where does this come from?
Yeah, it's fascinating, isn't it? I don't know whether it comes from like Englishmen in the castle type situation or what it is. Whether it's that inheritance of kind of that American culture that we did a bit of in the mid 20th century, mid kind of the middle to the second three quarters of the 20th century, where we were inheriting a lot of Americana and attitudes. The urban development attitudes we took in off the back of what was called the Buchanan Report back in the 60s, which involved a huge amount of redevelopment of our city centres in favour of the car. I think it comes. You know what? There's a whole episode just at that specific question of why, and I'm not going to do. And I do it to some extent. I talk about it in the book, which I will sneakily mention again. But there's a lot at play. The key thing is almost looking at the consequence of that. Is that in many, not all, but many of our cities and towns, frankly, we have torn up urban realm in favour of moving around 2-ton metal boxes. People often go, well, the death of the high street. It's this, it's that, it's that. No, it's because we built it's because we developed our towns and a lot of out of town retail, by the way, around cars.
And it's ugly.
Of course, the
it's very ugly.
Like the places that people feel nicest, the urban developments that people feel most, that are frankly the most economically successful, but also that people feel happiest in, are ones where cars are nowhere to be seen.
Yes.
I remember spending a bit of time in Ljubljana, which is the Slovenian capital, and a few years back, they just said, you know what, we're going to yeet all the cars out the city centre flatly. That's it. No, nothing. No. There'll be a few little electric bobbins that go back and forth for people with mobility issues and such, but no cars in the city centre. Other cities that have done this, you can tell, but in Ljubljana, it was particularly noticeable because I stood in the city centre and the noises you could hear were people. You could hear laughing, chatting, that general buzz, that hum that you get of groups of people meandering around, enjoying each other's company and getting on and having a really nice time. It helps. It's a very beautiful city. But the fact that the noise I was hearing wasn't traffic noise, it wasn't tire on tarmac, it wasn't the beeping, it wasn't all this noise, it wasn't even the low hum from when it's a little bit of a distance away. You couldn't hear it at all, and you could just hear humanity enjoying it. That is, firstly, it was absolutely beautiful. It's just this real, quite a kind of a bit of a whoa moment. That is what we want in all of our urban realm, is to have that, is to rediscover the humanity. And it's so much about our culture and our society and our, and the kind of the driving thrust of populism is because we've been so isolated from each other. We've been pushed into tiny little fragmented corners away from each other, and have lost that feeling of collective kind of endeavor.
It's interesting. You kind of frame it as car populism, which is kind of true. Yeah. I mean, the right-wing politicians are doing that. They're saying, why are we spending so much money on net zero and green projects? Let's just cut fuel tax. And it's kind of a car populism. But on the flip side, it's not really populism, because I would argue that most people would, when we go to Europe, we say, oh, so beautiful, why can't we have that? I just think they don't understand why that is. I mean, creating cities around just cars, which, by the way, it's a ever expanding project, right? It's congestion because of cars, right? We need to build more spaces, but then more cars, cars join. It's very strange. I guess it's kind of clever, but it's buying into what we've already been used to. And the thing is, we need to change that, but it's a big political project to do, to try and say to a nation which is fundamentally relies on cars, to say, you're all doing it wrong. We need to get rid of cars. It needs to be 90% public transport.
And this is where I think the local question comes in, because the way you win that battle is at a local level, is at a street level. It's actually getting boots on the ground. It's getting politicians, activists, campaigners, scientists, whoever it is. It's going out and speaking to people and talking about their issues they have on a street by street basis. And you build up from that level, because as soon as you say, well, actually, okay, lots of parking. Is there a way that we can actually reduce your need to have the car? Can we provide better, the bus services allow you to, what would switch you from deciding to own a car to not deciding to own a car? What would switch you from deciding you're going to drive a lot to not driving a lot? On a street-by-street level, this is why local politics, which has been stripped away, whether it's funding of local councils, whether it's parties just devaluing their Labour Party, perfect example of utterly devaluing their local politicians in favour of the PLP, the Parliamentary Party. Green Party are actually pretty good at street politics, as is the good parts of the Labour Party, actually. The best parts of the Labour Party are the ones that are really well in touch with their grassroots. Islington North is a constituency that I think embodies that very well, but lots of others do. Manchester and Glasgow and other cities where both the Greens and the Labour Party are very good at on-the-ground campaigning, speaking to people at street, at councillor level, at ward level and below, of going, what are your needs, and delivering those needs. Because and particularly in urban areas, rural people often say, well, don't forget about what about the countryside? What, I need to drive because there's no public. It's like, you can still drive, because frankly, the carbon emissions, the impacts of your mobility are, don't get me wrong, your individual carbon footprint is far higher than if you lived in a city, and that's your personal choice. But frankly, fine, if you're a farmer, then it's great that you're in the countryside because I need you to keep producing food. That's not the big problem. You can keep doing that because it accounts for trivial. The impacts of the fact that all the people who live in cities but still choose to drive, that's where we tackle, and that's at street level we fix those problems.
And if you start SUVs going into London,
exactly,
but I think a lot of people do understand how ridiculous that is, though. You don't need a big SUV going in through London. It does make me laugh, and I do think people recognise that.
Fix it at street level, and then you end up feeding upwards into, it's almost like fractal, right? So then you start thinking, well, okay, strategically, we've got all those people who need that. We will need a metro line to deliver the level of capacity we need to fulfill those people's mobility needs without them having a car. Buses won't work because it's too many buses to actually deliver. So you start at that point, if you start grassroots as well as the strategic vision at the top, of course, so that incentive that I've talked about before, work from the bottom up, if you like, you start establishing a picture that can then start driving devolved bodies, whether it's something like Transport for the North, or whether it's the Greater Manchester City, or whether it's Wycombe in West Yorkshire, for yourself in Leeds, and it kind of works its way up from that. So you then start delivering better bus services, better public transport to deliver those mobility needs from street level. But because if you start at street level, or certainly if you're making sure you're having that conversation at street level, people will buy into it. They'll buy into it, and that's really important. You want people to buy into the picture, buy into that, and it's about painting a vision of the future. We just don't bother doing that much, certainly at a regional and national level. We do a very bad job of bothering to paint an exciting picture of what mobility will look like in the future. No one does. I've written a book that's been quite successful. I'll stop mentioning the bloody book, I promise.
You're more than welcome to plug it as many times as you like.
I'm not going to wave it around in front of everyone. It's, no one knows what it's called yet. I'll talk about that then. But anyway, I've painted a picture of what the future can look like from a rail perspective, and no one's ever done that before. You get a million history books about railways, great. You get books that are about the contemporary railway and why it's rubbish, but no one's written a book about how the railways specifically can work really well and what that will look like. And government, that should be government's job. Government should be painting a picture of what exciting future mobility can look like. And it's so rare. Even HS2 didn't really bother painting that picture. They had glossy videos of fast trains going back and forth. That doesn't mean anything to anyone. How did I personally benefit from that snazzy fast train? Well, that was never told to me. So I think that local picture, localizing the benefits of the picture we want overall at strategic level is critical to getting people on board.
Yeah, and I guess that doesn't surprise me now that we're pushing for electric vehicles, which it's still better than petrol-based cars polluting our planet. But to me, it's still very neoliberal. It's an individualist response to climate change. It's green capitalism, and I draw parallel to the US because they kept saying they're going to build rail infrastructure by such and such time, always failing on their so-called commitments.
Yep.
Then you've seen demonstrations of Elon Musk's or the Boring Company, the Loop, the Tesla tunnel, an incredibly unimaginative and frankly wrong answer to transport and climate change.
It's just a buried lane of traffic. It's nothing. It's absolutely nothing exciting whatsoever. Yeah, that stuff, the kind of the gadget ban stuff, the tech industry trying to be like, oh, we can reinvent transport. Those are small ideas, made to look big. They're dismal and awful. But I think that. Firstly, the idea of democratic, liberal politicians saying, well, we're going to do this thing in the future, and that's why you should vote for us, is a classic move, and it's why we're seeing the rise of populism and authoritarian leaders across the Western world, if you like, because we're seeing, the reason the US election went the way it was is because there was a choice between someone who was saying they weren't going to change anything and someone who was saying they were going to change something. And if you're in a situation where you're struggling, cost of living is increasing, and you've got politicians who are saying, I will change something, even if they are nutters, if Trump is the one saying I will change something, whereas you've got Kamala Harris going, I'm going to change nothing, people are going to vote for change. Whether it's good or bad, they're going to be like, well, I'm not in a good situation now, so if nothing changes, I'm stuck. Like, something changing is going to be better than nothing changing. And that apathy, that liberal apathy, is kind of one of the main problems we have. And it comes from, a lot of it comes from an inability to really grasp the future and actually deliver it rather than saying you're going to deliver it. We've seen the same on Wade v. Roe and the consequence that had, all these things, that similar picture. It's extremely frustrating that we get lost in that and we don't deliver it. I think the thing with cars is, one of the things I say about EVs is that, EVs are the future for cars, but cars cannot be the future of transport. So there are dozens of reasons for that. EVs solve one problem for cars, and that is tailpipe emissions. That's carbon emissions. They don't get rid of pollution from tires and brakes. They don't get rid of the safety issues. In fact, they potentially make them worse because they're heavier. So 30,000 people a year are killed or seriously injured on Britain's roads. 30,000 people a year are killed on US roads. That is an epidemic of enormous. If anything else was causing that death, other than perhaps gun crime in the US, then there would be moves to tackle it. In the UK, it's shocking.
A really astonishing fact about EVs is how environmentally damaging they are to manufacture. Something I didn't know. Yeah. So can you expand on that? Because that's really interesting.
Yeah, so there's a few things, like the batteries themselves have a lot of kind of pretty ethically dubious materials. Lithium is causing, mining lithium itself is causing problems.
Which doesn't surprise me that Musk is heavily involved with this. So we know him.
Heavily involved, yeah. Lithium. I mean, cooing governments, attempting to coup governments to get access to lithium. It's really crazy stuff like that. Lithium is one element. As close as Serbia, out in kind of southeastern Europe, is currently undergoing a massive series of let's say, environmental challenges, and possibly the only thing that's going to threaten Vucic's government at the moment is actually this furore over a massive lithium mine going on in that Rio Tinto are trying to smash through in Serbia. But this is the same in South America. The salt flats, these wonderful salt flats in Chile, are heavily impacted by lithium evaporation ponds and lithium mining. So, and we're going to need if we continue on the trajectory of bigger, heavier cars, car-oriented mobility, not to mention heavy goods vehicles and trucks. Like, that's almost like it's almost like fantasy that we're going to be able to swap those like for like. But even just thinking about cars, we need this enormous leap in the production of lithium alone, and that's going to mean almost like colonialism 2.0, like almost this rediscovery of like dropping ethics, dropping regulation, exploiting workers. And that's before we talk about cobalt. That's before we talk about the carbon emissions from building all these cars. It's before we talk about all the other elements of bringing these cars, and also as you say, that individualized form of mobility anyway. That's huge. And also just metals, plastics. These are to have a 2-ton metal and plastic box around you as on average 1.1 or 1.5 people in a car versus many, percentage wise, far fewer materials going into better forms of mobility, particularly when it's cycling or walking, but also of course bus or train. Far more efficient way of using even basic materials like metals and then concrete. Because, of course, roads are an extremely inefficient way of moving people around if they're in cars. Bicycles are very good on roads, but bicycles are only really good over short distances. And the main carbon output we have as a society comes from long-distance travel on our roads. So again, if you want to stop using up space, a very valuable resource, actual land use, if you want to get some of that space back, then motorways are a hugely inefficient way to move people around, whereas a 2-track railway can move 10 times as many people as a massive motorway does. So efficiency of space, efficiency of materials, efficiency of those ethically dubious materials. I don't, it's not that I think we should retreat into caves and stop developing technologies, but actually particularly when we have the climate is a major threat to our species, right? And it's not just in the sort of the big stuff like sea level rise, but it's also scarcity of materials, whether it's agriculture and our access to food, or whether it's access to resources, supply chains being impacted. We actually, whether we're developing, in order to continue developing as a society, simplicity is going to be a major important variable in how we develop technology going forwards. Whereas, as we've seen over the last 20 years, everything's been about making the kit that we hold, wobbling my phone around, as complex as possible to justify increasing costs. We're going to have to move away from that, and that doesn't mean retreating into caves. It just means being much more clever and sensibly clever, not capitalist clever, but really sensibly clever, ethically clever about our technologies and our kit and how we survive and thrive as a species.
I mean, so how much do you think politicians know about the high cost of EV, especially the cost of the planet? And it's kind of a weird contradiction in my head, because they're willing to spend money on promoting these projects, despite most of them wedded to the idea of balancing the books, being conservative on spending, in order to keep the neoliberal orthodoxy. And I apologize that I do bring this back to neoliberalism, but I feel like for me, it's the fundamental reason that underpins why we have bad transport policy. I think there's a lot of things that come out of that. But I mean, do you think it's that, or rather, again, our decision makers have zero imagination? They can't seem to comprehend that it's far better and cheaper and more efficient to have excellent public transport.
I think do not attribute to malice what can be adequately explained by stupidity.
Yeah.
I dare say we have politicians that are, if I'm going to speak favourably, at a local and national level, often just extremely busy. And so they reach out to think tanks, they reach out to industry to try and get answers. And unfortunately, once you do that, you find yourself reaching into the organizations that have time to say anything publicly are ones that have deep pockets. Mm-hmm. And invariably, that's the automotive industry, it's the aviation industry. They're the ones who are funding think tanks, they're the ones who are funding the research themselves. Railways, funnily enough, don't really have a well-funded lobby group, if any. There are a few small parliamentary groups at the European level, and some, you've got the Campaign for Better Transport and others, and you've got mugginses like me who shout about it as much as I can. But compared to like the massive automotive sort of lobby groups, whether it's via think tanks or whether it's themselves as kind of collaborations, or as like as Ford, as Nissan, as Vauxhall, as individual organizations, they are an extremely powerful lobby, and they will paint a picture that looks nice to politicians. That is because it comes back to the kind of the FM versus AM question, which is a thing I like to come back to, which is FM. Well, AM is like actual machines. So this is like the messy, dirty, real world we live in versus fucking magic, which is like the idea that we can solve all of our mobility issues by just switching all of our petrol and diesel vehicles to EVs. It sounds magical because it's not because it sounds clean. You just go, oh, everyone can live exactly as they do now. And all we need to do is swap their petrol car with an electric car. That's perfect. It doesn't change anything. When, of course, it changes so much. It causes so many problems, as we've already talked about. So that AM versus FM thing, the trouble is politicians like FM because they're easy. They're mostly politically easy. They don't look like they're going to threaten their electoral chances by them having to do something unpopular. You know, in a situation where politicians are chasing votes rather than chasing after the future, we're always going to have a situation where they go for what seems like the easy answer. Unfortunately, the easy answer is often the FM answer. It's just like the same with Wes Streeting. I mean, Wes Streeting, frankly, an evil man with lots of really unpleasant things to say that I would love if there was a by-election that involved him he would be gone and it'd be very nice. But one of the things he has said about the NHS is that the way to fix the NHS is not with things like, I don't know, say, funding social care, funding councils to fund social care so that the NHS isn't the service of last resort, isn't investing in hospitals, isn't expanding nurse training programs and doctor training programs. No, those are all AM. Forget those. They're actual solutions. No. It's reform and AI, which of course is fucking magic. So like the key thing here is that the solutions that seem clean and easy are invariably not viable. They're not real.
But
and AM solutions are messy.
That's the problem.
Yeah, exactly.
Very easy to sell.
So if you've got this combination of difficult but real solutions versus easy but impossible made up fiction solutions, and politicians who are just really busy, because again, in the UK in particular, we've made our MPs have to do everything because we've massively decreased the power of local authorities. MPs end up doing the job of their councillors. MPs should not be doing half the stuff MPs are doing. It's good that they are a local representative, but frankly, half the stuff, if not 60% of the stuff that MPs do, should be done by local authorities.
Well,
be done by
I heard
councils.
a story about Rachel Reeves was intervening in a story about someone's tree in their front garden. I don't think MPs should be dealing with that.
The whole point of an MP is that essentially you're outsourcing your ability to think. We're so busy as workers, we're so busy trying to make ends meet that we're outsourcing our ability to think about the future to MPs. And that's good. They are essentially, MPs are our future thinkers, right? That's kind of what we're paying them to do. And that's good. That's great. And they're paying them to represent our views and also represent what the future should look like. So our expectation is that they've got the time to do that. They shouldn't then also be doing all the stuff like sorting out local homelessness, sorting out local specific issues. I'm not saying no one should be doing that, but local councillors should be doing that. But unfortunately, we've got a situation where local authorities have been stripped of so much cash and power that MPs end up doing all that, so they don't have time to do the big thinking. And herein lies a lot of the problem, because if you've got very few MPs who are willing to do the big thinking, you've got very few MPs shouting at Treasury to do bigger thinking, shouting at the DFT to do bigger thinking.
And Treasury doesn't want to do the big thinking as well.
No, they don't. But if you have a situation... Yeah, and some of that is longer rooted, but a lot of the recent lack of long-term thinking comes from the PFI push that was happening through the mid, through the late 80s, but particularly through the 90s, right the way through the end of the Major years and certainly through the Blair years, where essentially there was this culture pushed out within Treasury, and Treasury was all in charge of it. And there's a reason why Treasury is still in charge of our big like infrastructure kind of quangos. It's always like if you work out where that like the National Infrastructure Commission, for example, that sounds like a thing that should be like DFT, right? No, that's Treasury. It's a Treasury body. Treasury have their hands on all this stuff because of the legacy of PFI. Yeah. That's not the root of the we don't think big strategic problems in Treasury, but it certainly embedded them in a way that's really difficult to pull it out of pull that copper out the walls and start from scratch. So yeah, Treasury is certainly a source of the issue, but I think our MPs, it's funny how much stuff comes to funding local authorities properly. So in a roundabout way, we might have bigger thinkers in our MPs if we had better funded local authorities. But yeah,
I mean, this is quite good. What I said at the beginning kind of goes full circle. How I said transport's political, because we are talking about the realms of the entire public realm because of it. Now, I was born in Bristol. I know you said at the beginning that we're both Northerners. Unfortunately, I'm not a Northerner, but I live in the North, thankfully. But, back in Bristol, our local transport was...
Let's go to Bristol and find out what's going on down there.
It's not a good situation, because our buses are owned by the god-awful First Group. Terrible services. I was always late for work. Grimy interior. It was just horrible. Then I moved to Nottingham, and we had excellent trans. And I was astonished, because I thought, you only see this in Europe. And I saw a real-world example in the UK of the disparity between cheap, clean and consistent transport to slow, ugly and unpleasant privately owned buses. Now I'm in Leeds, and it's back to buses owned by the First Group.
If you thought Bristol's buses were bad.
I had my run-ins. And the thing is, I had a flyer in the post a while back from Tracy Brabin, the Mayor of West Yorkshire, promising trams and the link to Bradford to Leeds. And every conversation I've had with Leeds residents is, they've been promising this for years and years. It never happens. So why does it seem to be so difficult to implement trans? Is it because of the existing infrastructure? Is it too difficult to bring in places that don't already have tram tracks in the first place?
No, I'll give you the answer, and the answer is very simple. It's that local authorities don't have the money to actually invest in the stuff. Because if local authorities had the devolved power to raise that money to spend on trams, we'll come back to Nottingham in a second. If the local authorities had the ability to raise that money to invest in local transport, it would have happened much quicker. The trouble is, local authorities, city authorities have to go cap in hand to Treasury to ask for central government funding for these projects. And that requires utterly pointless and contrived business cases that don't mean anything. And that is why Alistair Darling cancelled the last iteration of Leeds Trams, Leeds Supertram. It's why before that it was cancelled as well. Similar stories in Manchester with urban transit, particularly in the north. We've seen those stories. Why is it that Nottingham have been a bit different? Well, Nottingham raised a workplace parking levy. And the workplace parking levy has a dual effect of reducing the incentive to drive into the city centre and allows them to fund their expansions of the Nottingham tram system. So they're a rare situation where we have the ability to raise local funds and they can be immediately deployed into expanding the tram system. This is basically the key challenge is that until you devolve the ability to raise funds to local level and frankly, allocate set funding that the government has no say over how it gets spent, and they just set a fixed amount of funding that's in 10-year lumps, or it's annually, but the government, but the local authority is allowed to kind of borrow ahead and spend a little less this year, more the following year, whatever. But set lumps of money that local authorities set out. By the way, everyone outside of London is owed £5,000 on public transport, right? Everyone outside of London, it's just on rail through my lifetime since 1990. £5,000 more per head have been spent on rail transport within the M25 than anywhere else in the UK. Now, what does that mean? That means in a city like Manchester, that's £12 billion that Manchester should by rights have to spend on public transport infrastructure. Leeds, £10 billion. South Yorkshire, £8 billion, £9 billion. These are enough. This is enough money to build a dedicated metro system, not bloody trams. So, this is the level of investment that should be happening if we had appropriate devolved power and authority to local areas. So, no, the answer, it's not about the end. It's not about the engineering. It's about the politics. It's about the fact that we have the most centralized economy in the world, way too much power centralized into Westminster and into Treasury. I'm very careful not to say London, because London actually has the same problems, that they also have had their power actually ceded back to Westminster in the last 5 years, when Boris took the grant away from central government from TfL. So it's about devolution. As soon as you devolve power to raise funds or at least give a dedicated pot of money that central government has no say over to Leeds would have trams within a decade. But until that happens, trams won't get built. Frankly, they will not get built.
To not sound naive, why can't Leeds and Manchester do the same as Nottingham? Why can't they do their own ways and their own funding? I understand obviously we need more funding to it, but why can't they do that?
It's interesting, isn't it? So I don't know whether it's because Nottingham had the municipal buses as well, which is another reason why the buses are very good, is because it's a municipally owned bus company, and that gave the impetus for the local party local Labour Party to push for it. There are also elements of central government saying, no, don't do the workplace parking levy, because we're going to give you a bit more autonomy next year, then next year, and then next year, and it never happens.
Bit of a bargaining chip, possibly as well.
Bargaining chip, but also local Labour parties not being willing to have that fight. Mm-hmm. I think there's an element of that, like local authorities not being willing to have the fight, but also there are also statutory things at play. I think that Burnham Burnham was bitten by the stupid way they did the congestion charge in Manchester, the referendum on that, which was frankly very badly done and shouldn't have gone to a referendum. It should have just been rolled out, but in a staged way. It's the political. It's exactly as you say. It's the political, and it's the reality is that there need to be just massive, blunt divvying off of power to local authorities, to city regions, and the Labour Party have been talking about that happening for a very long time, and they've been talking big. Gordon Brown did his sort of report that he did, 3 or 4 years ago, maybe not even that, 2-3 years ago, about the need to sort of almost federalise the UK, to kind of involve, increase local democratic involvement as well. But we will not. I will say this again: we will not fix transport. We will not build these local systems. Trams, frankly, trams are the half of it. Leeds needs a metro system. Trams are not metros. Trams are just good buses that happen to be a railway-based system. Trams are a great step, but actually Leeds is a big enough and dense enough city that it should have dedicated suburban railway lines, metro system type situation. Manchester also certainly should. So, in order to achieve that, we need billions to be spent, and billions to be spent quickly, and it ain't going to happen until we see devolution of power and funding authority to city regions.
Now, you are the founding member of the Campaign for Level Boarding. So for people
One of.
Okay. So for those that don't know, there's around a 275mm disparity between the level of the tube compared to the platform. And the campaign is clear it's an issue with accessibility. So why have they been made that way? I mean, it sounds like a huge oversight. Or is there a reason the tube infrastructure was initially built with such a disparity in height between the tube and the platforms?
So this is not just the tube. This is across our railways. So this is across our railway systems. Actually, particularly focused on the national railway network. So not even tube. Actually, we're focusing more on the overall national railway network. The reason we have this disparity, this difference, is it's as simple as stagecoaches had a floor height in the 1700s, and then we built our trains the same as, because the early trains were made of just stagecoaches on railway wheels, and we've kind of just developed our trains off the back of that template and never really challenged it. And in a way, that the floor height of 1100 millimeters kind of worked fine when we didn't care about disabled people. But as soon as it's interesting, you can go back to the 1860s, and there are actually quotes from various journals of the day going, this gap between the platform and the train is unacceptable and it has resulted in harm. And the response from the the 100 or so railway companies there were in the 1860s was, oh, the railways were not the product of a day. Which is exactly the same excuse that gets used today by Network Rail in defending its infrastructure. Well, not even by Network Rail, because Network Rail are only get done what government tell them to do. By government, when people challenge the fact that we have platforms that don't match trains. Actually, the platform position is nationally standardized. It's a standard position, 915 millimeters. The challenge we've got is that we keep other than in a few exceptions in recent years, we keep procuring trains that have this high floor height that's kind of the same floor height that we've always had trains floors at. Whereas we've seen now with the Merseyrail trains, the class 777s for the nerds, and some of Greater Anglia's fleet as well, called the Flirts. Those trains have this is a revolutionary idea. You'll like this. The floor is built to match the height of the platform.
Wow.
Incredible stuff, right? Engineering genius at play here. No, they've just got a low floor that matches the platform height. And it means that you can have a level interface. Campaign for Level Boarding is really a campaign to kind of raise awareness of that solution, of the fact that it's not just that ramps are a necessary part of travel for disabled people or people with buggies or whatever it happens to be. But no, if you have level boarding, it's not perfect. The solutions, we could get into the weeds of like some of the details of what allows you to optimize that interface, but it's not a perfect solution, but it's so much better than what you've described, that 200-300 millimeter sort of diagonal gap from the platform to the train. So if we procure it's about systems thinking. If we were doing more systems thinking, a less fragmented industry, we would be procuring trains that fit. Elizabeth Line, Crossrail is unfortunately the perfect example. Rather than procuring trains with a low floor that match the platforms in the outer sections, so where where Crossrail is mixed with other services, they built the central section tunnels. The station platforms were built high to match the high floor of the trains. What that means is that those trains that have high floors can never provide accessible level boarding in the outer sections of the railway where you've got mixed traffic, because you can never adjust the platforms in those mixed traffic sections up to meet those trains. So they have locked, by building the railway that way, rather than procuring the right trains and then building the central section tunnels properly, they've locked in inaccessibility on the Elizabeth Line forever, essentially. Fixing that problem will be very, very, very expensive and involve rebuilding the stations in the central section tunnel.
That's what I was thinking, because obviously you're going to have different levels of platforms in different areas. And I guess that's why they've done, and it's not an excuse, but that's why they've done ramps as a sort of a temporary fix. Because obviously, if you were to temporary fix, but rebuild platforms, you would be stopping trains for a long time.
Yeah, we have a standard platform, and platform reconstruction is an absolutely bread and butter thing that the railways do all the time. Yep. We do it when we introduce new stock. We do it for various reasons, when we're readjusting tracks, whatever. It's my day job, bread and butter stuff, and or was, and so doing that platform work, we have a standard platform position. We can and should be set. It's another perfect example of a rolling program of work. We can and should be setting platforms to those positions, and then if you do that alongside ensuring that you procure level boarding capable trains, then you eventually will fix the problem. And actually what's really good, and a success of the campaign for level boarding, is that by and large, new rolling stock orders are now acknowledging that they must be level boarding capable. Good. So we have made, it's a win. We've actually kind of succeeded on the front. There are some mistakes. Unfortunately, we had an enormous surge in new rolling stock in kind of 2015 to 2018, 2019, and very little of it was level boarding capable. So that's another 40 years of those trains running around without providing level boarding. But we have seen progress on it. When it comes to the tube specifically, that is much more complex, because when it's all in tunnels, you've got curvy platforms, that becomes and you know, within a tunnel particularly, that is much more complex and challenging to deal with. But we have seen some of the solutions in, you know, where Bank Station, they've realigned one of the platforms, built a new platform tunnel. It's straight, and you now do have level boarding on the Northern Line tunnels at Bank. So that, you know, it is possible. You know, Crossrail does, it showed there within the central section, you can see what level boarding does look like, even if it is a problem in the outer section. So we now know what the picture should look like. The challenge is thinking systemically to deliver it.
Gareth, an absolute pleasure, and I really felt your passion. And of course, you have a book, How the Railways Will Fix the Future. You could do a proper plug now. I want to hear it.
I can now, but I'm so sorry for mentioning it earlier. But if anyone enjoyed this enthusiastic, if rambling meander through. So, by the way, Curtis, some really lovely, interesting questions to pick through. So I really enjoyed that. How the Railways Will Fix the Future. It is available anywhere you like. All good bookshops, all good independent. In fact, to be honest, independent bookshops have more of them than the likes of Waterstones for various like independent and versus main publishing group non-interesting reasons. But you can get it anywhere you like. You can order it from the Evil website if you like as well. It's available everywhere. It's doing very well, which I'm pleased about. But it has kind of all this stuff in it. That systemic thinking. It's actually less a railway book and more a kind of political philosophy book in a kind of a way that's kind of interesting because I ground it with the railways, but hopefully interesting, covers a lot of the ground we have. And Curtis, I would love to chat again if you'll have me back after this rambling chaos. But really pleasure.
I tell you what, it's very rare that you're doing an interview and you're learning so much, and I was learning on the spot. So really eye opening. Some of the questions you answered for me were superb. So I want to thank you for joining me today. And of course, we will 100% have you back on in the future.
Pleasure. It's just an absolute delight. And hopefully something interesting for all your viewers as well.